hard.
Fantastic. Okay, so my name is Travis. I'm with Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants, and I've got with me Jenna. She's with Adventures and Scientists for Conservation, and she has a diverse history of nonprofit work, from advocating for victims of domestic violence in rural Kansas to leading youth hiking and gardening clubs in Cape Town, South Africa. She's a longtime champion for the environment. Jenna is now focused on saving the Earth's waters from plastic pollution as ASC's Microplastics Program Manager. She manages the Global Microplastics Project and works with adventure volunteers around the world. So I'm very excited to introduce her, and I'm excited to hear you speak. Thanks, Jenna.
Sure. Thanks for having me, guys. I'm really excited to be a part of this and to be talking to you. I got a lot to talk about today. And let me see if I can pull up this PowerPoint so you don't just have to stare at my face. There we go. Share my entire screen. Come on. Okay. Is that working?
Yes, it is.
Okay, good. So I'm going to talk today about microplastics, but first we're going to start and tell you a little bit more about me. So I have always loved the environment and loved caring about animals and loved going for hikes and that sort of thing. And so growing up, I knew that I wanted to do something like that, where I got to be outside, where I got to make a difference. And I was living in Seattle, and I did a really neat project in the Olympic Peninsula, which is a big national park and forest area there, where I went out and I helped set up cameras to find an animal called the pine marten, which is kind of like a little weasel. And then I was working in Seattle taking kids outside and got to do on some awesome hiking trips and some camping trips with kids. And then only about 6 months ago, I moved to Montana to start this job with an organization called Adventures and Scientists for Conservation. So what Adventures and Scientists for Conservation does is connects scientists who really need to study something that's hard to study, or maybe they need to get into a remote part of a forest, or they want to study something on the top of a mountain. And we connect them with adventurers and explorers who are already out doing that. So, for instance, we have a project called the Snow and Ice Project. And with the Snow and Ice Project, we have people who are climbing mountains. Maybe they're going to ski down, maybe they're just trying to make it to the top. And then while they're up there, they're digging into the snow on the glaciers to get some samples that we'll send to a scientist who is studying glaciers. And so by connecting those two people, we're bringing that scientific work forward in big strides, where scientists couldn't go up and climb every mountain on their own. They need to have people help them do it. Another example of our work, like I said, is looking for wild animals. So this is a picture of one of our volunteers who is in Utah, and she went out and hiked deep into the woods, I think probably around 10 miles, and then set up these bait. She put bait on a tree, so that's what she's doing in that picture. And then across from that bait, we set up cameras. So if animals come and smell that bait and check it out, then the camera will automatically take a picture of them. And we're using that information to help learn about what animals are in those woods and what we can do to help them. So one of our projects that we are really focusing on right now is microplastics. And I know you guys have studied a little bit about plastics, at least in some way. So I'm going to start and talk briefly about the fact that plastics are great. So plastics are really durable and they're really cheap. And so we started making a lot of them in like the 1950s and started just churning out plastic because it was so useful in our lives. But we didn't really think about where that plastic would go at the end of the day. And so now we're finding that a lot of that plastic is ending up in the oceans, and it's ending up in our rivers and our lakes. These are just some pictures. I know some of you might be familiar with what plastics will do to animals in the ocean. Like you see fish or birds that get caught in the plastic rings from soda cans, or animals that eat large chunks of plastic and then they can't digest it. So there are a lot of negative effects of these large pieces of plastic, but I'm going to talk about microplastics. So microplastics are a little bit different than the big plastics. Just like you would think, micro means really small, microscopic, and so microplastics are these really small pieces of plastic. actually any particle of plastic that's smaller than 5 millimeters in size, all the way down to like teeny tiny things that you have to look at through a microscope to see them. And microplastic has a lot of different sources. So as you can see, there's a lot of different shapes and sizes of it, and it's coming from different things. So one of the things that's coming from is that big plastic that we talked about that's floating around in the ocean, or the plastic you see rolling down the street that might make its way into a river or into a sewer. That big plastic breaks down because it's in the sun and the waves and the salt water often, and it gets all churned up and breaks down into smaller and smaller pieces. And it keeps breaking down. Plastic never actually disappears entirely. It just gets smaller and smaller. So that's one source of these microplastics that we're finding in the water. Another source is these things we're calling microbeads. And these are particles of plastic, really small round balls, that are made specifically to go into facial cleansers or toothpaste or even some household washing supplies, so that they scrub your skin or they scrub your teeth. But really, they don't biodegrade. They just wash down the drain and they end up going into the sewer system. They're not filtered out at wastewater treatment facilities, and they're entering our rivers, they're entering our lakes, and they're flowing down into our oceans. Another way I'm going to talk to you about is this breakdown of plastics from clothing. So you might not know this, but a lot of synthetic clothing is actually made from plastic. That word synthetic means it's not made from natural materials. So it's not made from wool or wood or anything that grows in nature. It's made from a material that we make and synthesize. And so for a lot of things like polar fleece or stretchy pants, that is a type of plastic. Nylon, rayon, these kinds of words are really just fancy words for plastic. And so what's happening is when you put that plastic in the washing machine, it's getting broken down and shedding. So a polar fleece is kind of fuzzy, right? And that fuzz is shedding off and going down the drain of your washing machine. And just like those microbeads, isn't getting filtered out at the treatment sites, and it's just keeps flowing until it's rivers, our lakes, and our oceans. So what's the bigger problem with that? Plastics aren't just kind of gross. So the big problem is we're washing these fabrics. Then the wastewater goes through the treatment sites and into the water. And when it's in the water, it attracts organic pollutants. So what that means is it attracts toxins, and it attracts metals and other icky things that then stick to the plastic and are carried along with the plastic. And then we know that the plastic is being eaten by some animals out there. So it's being eaten by plankton and by fish and by birds. And so this might be causing some bigger health problems. So again, what I want to make clear is that it's not just gross that we're eating plastic. The bigger issue is that things stick to this plastic and things come off this plastic. So all these words like plasticizers and flame retardants are all just words for the chemicals that stick to plastic and then go along with plastic on wherever the plastic ends up. So if the plastic settles to the bottom of the sea, these toxins settle to the bottom of the sea. If the plastic gets eaten by plankton and then eaten by a fish or eaten by a whale, that plastic is going into that fish or whale. So my work with adventurers and scientists for conservation has started to work on microplastics because of the research of someone named Abigail Barrow. And she's a scientist in Maine, and she has been studying microplastics for a long time, and she came up with a methodology where she can look at a water sample and find out what tiny, tiny microplastics are in that water sample, and then she categorizes them. So the full process is someone takes a liter of water from an ocean, from a river, wherever they are. They send it to her lab. She's still in Maine, so she's got a cool little lab right on the shore of the ocean, and then she puts that water sample through a filter. So she you can see that little glass apparatus, and she pours the water through there, and there's a really finely meshed filter in between those two bottles, and all the little tiny plastic pieces get caught on that filter. And then she takes the filter out and she lets it dry in a petri dish, and then the next day or so she'll take that filter again, she'll put it under her microscope, she'll look at it under 40 times of a magnification, and then she can see these fibers or these little particles or these microbeads that are on the filter, and she goes ahead and she counts them and she categorizes them by shape, and by color, and puts them into different groups. So she's collecting all this data, and she's been doing this protocol in Maine, and she wanted to know more. She wanted to know what is there in the rest of the world. Besides just Maine, what can we find, and where are these microplastics, and how are they affecting our water? So we helped her out by putting the call out to all our adventurers worldwide. So people might be sailing across an ocean, they might be snorkeling on a reef, and we asked them to help get microplastic samples for Abby to look at. So these dots on this map represent where a sample has come from. Every single one of these dots, that sample has gone to Abby in Maine, and she's taken a look at it and tried to count the number of microplastics in that sample. So we had a lot of different adventurers help us out. One cool group is a group called Surf Explorer, who travels the world surfing, and they've also been working with local communities on different islands and different cool places that they've been, but also they send us water samples from all over these different islands and tropical surf spots. We have sailors who've crossed the entire oceans in their boats sending us water samples, kayakers, people running around in the north. We have samples from the Arctic. We have samples from Alaska. This is a really cool group of rowers. There's a race that happens from California to Hawaii every year, and many of the rowers on that race went ahead and sent us plastic samples. And then this is a group of sailboats that cross the Atlantic Ocean, and we had 200 samples come in from these sailors crossing the Atlantic Ocean, and they went right by this big, it's called a gyre, but it's like an island of plastic, all this plastic floating in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, and so they took samples right by the gyre. So some of those samples had really high numbers of plastic in them. So all of these samples, as I said, then get counted for microplastics, and the most recent thing we've thought is, like, what else is there besides the oceans? So we've started collecting samples from freshwater sources as well. This is actually one of our adventurers. She's a skier, so she goes all over the world skiing, and she's collecting a water sample for us in this picture in Italy. So we're really getting these freshwater samples as well to help us better understand where microplastics are in the world. And what are we finding so far? We have 1,198 samples have been collected and sent to us so far, which is a huge number. No one scientist could ever go get all that many samples in the amount of time that we've been able to do it. And of those samples, 93% of them had plastic. So more than 1,000 of these samples contained plastic pieces in them in some amount. We've had different amounts. Some plastics have none. Obviously, there's 7% that aren't containing plastic. But then we've had numbers up to like the thousands where Abby can't count them using just her eyes, down to people that have 2 or 3. And so the average is about 13 or 14 pieces of plastic in a liter of water. And we have found plastic in every ocean and on all 7 continents. So we know that plastic is all over the place. We know this isn't a single problem in a single place, but it's a global problem. We do still have a lot of questions. So while we know that plastic is everywhere, we don't exactly know where it's coming from. So one of the questions we're always trying to look for is, where is exactly is this coming from? We talked about the sources, but is a certain place giving off more than another place? Is there, you know, a certain area that's really bad for plastics? One of the problems that happens when we look at plastics in the ocean is it's really hard to say this plastic came from these people and this plastic came from this company and this plastic came from that place, because we all have an effect on the ocean. So it's really hard to say exactly where it's coming from. So we're looking at freshwater to try and start answering some of those questions. So if you see a river, you might have a better idea of where that plastic might be entering the river if there is a community on that river. We also have a lot of questions about how prevalent it is in freshwater. So we've been looking, but we still need a lot of samples to say that for certain it's everywhere. We're definitely finding a lower percentage of microplastics in freshwater samples. So while it's 93% of all our samples, it's only 84% of the freshwater samples. So still a lot, definitely, but it's not in every body of water. And so that information is important for us to know to move forward. And then there's so many more questions like, what do those toxins that are attached to the plastics actually do when they get to humans? How much do they transfer through different animals? We do know that seafood for sale in some markets has been found to have plastic inside it, but we don't know how bad of an effect that has on us or what's the best way to go about solving this issue. So there's a lot of questions we still need to answer, and that's why my organization is still doing work on this. I bet a big question you guys are having is, what can you do about it? And that's a big question for all of us, and one of the reasons we're still working so hard to solve this is we want to know what we can do to stop it. And so some really simple things that you and your family can help do is just to reduce how much plastic you use. So if you think about your daily life, how much plastic do you come into contact with? So buying a bottle of water when you could reuse a water bottle. So making that switch is a really simple way. Straws are another thing. People hand us straws all the time, but do we really need straws every time we drink a glass of water or a glass of juice? So taking those small steps to say, like, I don't really want to use a straw today, or I'm going to bring my own water bottle or my own shopping bag to the grocery store. Reminding your mom to use those bags she has instead of getting a new plastic one. Or think about plastic bags when you come to your lunchroom. I bet there's a ton of plastic bags there. So if we all started to reuse things, use your plastic bag again, get a special container to bring your lunch in. I'm sure a lot of you do, but these are really great ways that we can reduce our own plastic. I know a lot of you guys probably don't do the shopping in your house, so this one's not that easy. But if you see the word microbeads on the outside of a face wash or a toothpaste that someone in your family is buying, you might want to look and see if there's plastics in there. Plastics often go by the words polyethylene or polypropylene. Now, I don't expect you to remember that, but if it does say that it contains microbeads, chances are that's made of plastic. So just be aware of what's out there. And then also be dirty. We talked a lot about how the clothing that we wear can shed in the wash and rinse plastics down the drain. That doesn't mean you have to be super dirty and never wash your shirt again, but the less that you're washing these synthetic fabrics, the less often you wash your polar fleece. If you just get a little bit of something on it, you can just keep wearing it another couple times. And you don't have to wash your shirt every day or every week. So you can go ahead and tell your parents that I said you could be a little dirty this time to help the environment out just a little bit. So where's my hangout? That's actually all I have. So that went pretty quick, hopefully not too painful. But I can take questions. How do I unscreen share?
Thank you very much, Jenna. I'm just going to see if I can unmute the other two classes. So we have with us Mrs. Hoffman's grade 5 class from Toronto, where I'm sitting right now as well. And then we also have Mrs. Selena's grade 4 class, grade 4 science class from San Antonio in Texas. So we got an international group here.
Wow.
So let me see if I can get this to be unmuted. I think actually if everyone can go to their computer and they might be able to unmute it from there. That might be the best way to do it. So if Mrs. Hoffman or Mrs. Selena could unmute it on their computer.
Can you hear us?
Yeah, I can hear you, Mrs. Hoffman, and then Mrs. Selena, yeah.
Hello, can you hear us? Hello.
Yes, we can. Wonderful. Great. So how about we do a question from Mrs. Selena's class down in Texas.
Hey, thank you. This question's coming from Josh. Here you are, sir. Have a seat.
Okay. Will my purifier keep my water clean from the microplastics that in the water?
Right. So you mean like the purifier that's on a pitcher that you drink, or the purifier that you put on your faucet?
Yeah, like the one on the faucet.
Yeah, so that will. Those are designed to keep out really tiny, tiny particles too. So they're designed to keep out bacteria and chemicals as well. So those things are really small, like the microplastics. So when you put that tap water in your cup, it would catch any microplastics. I will say that the water that we drink does not necessarily have high amounts of these microplastics. I can't say for sure that it doesn't have any because I don't know. I haven't tested it. But we hope that most of those microplastics aren't going to go in our drinking water. The problem is they go in the water that goes down into the ocean, not into the water that comes back out of our faucets. But if it was there, your filter would probably help clean it out. Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
They're going to ask us next, but just wait.
You're muted.
We can't hear you.
There we go. Mrs. Hoffman's class, do you have someone that wants to ask a question?
Hello, I'm
Hi.
Zach.
Hi.
I have a question for Jen.
Yep.
Jen. Is it true, like all the commercials, it says like there 1 year there was like there was enough water bottles to circle the world? Are those true?
Yeah, we use so many plastics just one time. I've heard that more than half of the plastic that we use less than one time. So think about like packaging on any new thing that you buy, or the times you use plastic forks. Water bottles and we call them single-use plastics. Those are a huge problem because we just use them one time and then we throw them away, and we don't really pay attention to where they go. So yeah, I don't know the actual statistics that are in that particular commercial, but there are a lot of water bottles that are just in garbage, landfills, and things like that. And so the first way to help is definitely to reduce the amount of plastic that you use.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
And again, from Mrs. Salinas' class, any more questions there?
Hi, we have a question from Sophia.
Hi.
Do you think we can make the items with microplastics in another way without microplastics?
That's a really good question. Finding solutions is so important to this project and why we're doing it. So a really good example is talking about those face washes that have microbeads in them. There are already face washes out there that don't use plastic to do the same thing. So there are face washes that use tiny crushed up shells or nuts, like walnut shells, you know what I mean? Those are doing the same thing. They scrub on your face and they clean your face and your pores and all the things that the plastics do. But when they go down the drain and into the ocean, they're able to biodegrade. So that means they're able to break down until they basically disappear, where the plastic just sits there. So there are solutions. We are definitely talking to people who make those fabrics that we're worried about ways that they can make those fabrics differently or new materials that they can make those fabrics with so that it's not a problem. So maybe that in the future, a company that makes a fuzzy fleece will also make a fleece that either won't shed as much in the drain, or that's made of a material that does break down, that's biodegradable. And also, with the synthetic clothing, we already have a lot of clothing out there that's not made of plastic. So things that are like wool sweaters, which also keep you warm, are made of wool from sheep. And when that sheds and goes down the drain, it is able to break down and doesn't stay around the same way that plastic does, and doesn't have toxins attached to it that way that plastic does. So there are solutions out there, and it's going to be important to changing this issue, is coming up with new ways to make these products.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Mrs. Hoffman's class, do you have another question?
What projects are being done to get microbeads out of the ocean?
To get microbeads out of the ocean? So this is a really hard question because the plastics are so small that there's pretty much no way that we could just filter them out of the ocean. I mean, we're even struggling to get those big pieces of plastic out of the ocean. I know that, like, the gyres, those big islands of plastic, there's a lot of scientists trying to figure out if we can do anything about it at all. And microplastics are even harder because they're so small. So what we're really trying to focus on is stopping them before they get into the ocean. And so using different products, as I've mentioned, or we're not buying the products that actually have microbeads in them. I will say that microbeads, specifically the things that are in face wash or toothpaste, a lot of states in the United States are banning those so that they can't be sold in that state. And I actually think there's people working on it in Canada as well to stop selling microbeads altogether. So then the companies won't make those products, people won't buy them not knowing what they're doing, and the microbeads will stop going into the ocean.
Wonderful. And how about Mrs. Selena's class? Is there another question there from Texas?
Please come on up, Olivia.
My question is, do microplastics hurt people?
That's a really good question. So we don't know. That's one of the big question marks. We know for a fact that toxins hurt people. We've done a lot of studies on that. You might have heard of BPA or DDT. There's all these nasty chemicals that we know hurt people. And we also know that those chemicals attach to plastic particles when they encounter them in the water. So if BPA is in the water, or BPA actually also comes on many plastics, or if DDT is in the water and it comes in contact with a tiny piece of plastic, it'll catch on to it. We then know for sure that certain animals are eating those plastics. So we have videos, I wish I could show it to you, maybe I'll share it to your teachers, of plankton, so teeny, teeny, teeny little, almost microscopic animals in the oceans eat tiny, tiny, tiny pieces of plastic. And then that animal, plankton, is being eaten by larger and larger fish. We've also done a lot of studies where we look inside fish and see if there's plastic in there. Finding a lot. I've heard that 90% of seabirds, so birds that live near our ocean, have eaten plastic or contain plastic in their guts. And so we know that they're entering the food chain. We even know that in California and Indonesia, someone did a study where they went to the seafood markets, so the places that sell fish that we're going to eat, and they looked at how much plastic and fibrous material was in the guts of these fish that we were going to eat. And they found plastic there. So we know that it's like making its way up towards humans, but we don't know for sure if the actual toxins are then causing bad things in humans, because we haven't done that research yet. Science is a lot of step by step, and we're like doing all the little steps before we prove that it's bad for humans. But it kind of seems to me that it is going to prove to be bad for humans because we know all those other steps leading up to that fact.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Mrs. Hoffman's class, do you have another question for Jenna?
I'm Tyler.
Yes.
It's going from Tyler.
Hey, come on up.
Go ahead, Tyler.
I use a Vino soap when I take a shower, and does all of Vino soap have microbeads in them? Because I don't really want to hurt any wildlife.
Right. That's good that you don't want to hurt any wildlife. I don't know if all of Vino soap has it. I don't think 100% of a Vino soap does, but there are two special words that you can look for to make sure when you look at the box, and they're polyethylene and polypropylene. But it's even easier than that if you go online or tell your parents to download an app to their phones. There's an app called Ban the Microbead or Beat the Microbead. I think it's Beat the Microbead. But that app tells you all the products that have microbeads in them. So if you're at the store and you're wondering if it does, you can look on the app and it'll tell you, yes, this product is safe to use. And then you'll know when you buy it. So if that's something that you're really concerned about, you might want to tell your mom to, like, we heard about microbeads and I know that there's this app we can get. So, like, we make sure that we're answering these questions for ourselves. So that'd be a good place to start.
Great.
Thanks.
And Mrs. Celine, do you have any more questions from Texas?
Go ahead. Yes, we do.
Wonderful.
Hi. What will it look like in the future if we can't stop it?
What will it look like in the future? Gosh, I don't know. We can only really imagine, right? So if our oceans are really full of plastic, let's think about it. Someone actually said that some people call it a plastic soup, so it's like this liquid and there's lots of particles floating around in it. But then other people actually said it's more like a plastic smog. So if you guys know what smog is like, it's those big, thick clouds full of dark particles. So if the ocean is full of smog of plastic, and rivers and lakes are full of smog of plastic, and it's just getting thicker and thicker because the plastic's not going anywhere, it probably means that it's going to be harder and harder for fish to live in that smog or other animals to live in that smog, and that ocean's not going to be a very good place to be.
Yeah.
There's a name for that.
And Mrs. Hoffman, do you have one more question for Jenna?
Hi, I'm James. Do the face lotions, do the microbeads cover the pores, or what do they do in the lotion?
So in the face washes that you're talking about, they're supposed to be scrubbing. They call them like scrubbing microbeads, or micro scrubbers is actually what they say sometimes. And so it's supposed to just be washing your face, but it's actually just the same thing that like a washcloth does, or a loofah. So we have other ways that you can do the same sort of scrubbing just using a washcloth. You don't have to put plastic on your face to scrub it.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Jenna, do you have a few minutes for a couple more questions?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, let's do one each from Mrs. Salinas and then Mrs. Hoffman's.
Hi, we have Tatum coming up in just a second.
Okay.
Okay.
She's coming up.
This is Josephine.
How long did it take you to know about microplastics?
Me personally, I knew about it right away when I moved here. So I didn't know about it before when I was living in Seattle, and then I moved to Montana because these people gave me a job and they told me about it. But in terms of how long it's taken everybody to learn about microplastics, it's been a long time. So plastic started being made in big ways in the 50s, and we're only now, probably in the mid-90s, did we start to first see like, uh-oh, there's tiny pieces of plastic around here. And then only in the last 5 to 10 years are we really looking at what it is and what it means and studying it and knowing more and more and more. Even today, we're learning new things about microplastics all the time. So Abby, our scientist, is looking at some of the smallest particles that anybody's really looked at yet. And so we were saying that there wasn't as much plastic in the water column, and we thought it was either floating or sinking. But now that we're looking smaller, we see that it's actually all through there. So we're always learning new things.
Wonderful. And one more question from Mrs. Hoffman's class.
Hi, I'm Rachel. I was wondering, why don't microbeads ever biodegrade?
So that's one of the awesome things about plastic and why we like it is it doesn't break down. It's really sturdy. And it lasts a really, really, really long time. And so that's what's happening, is this plastic is just a really small version of that chair in the back of your room or anything else we use that's made of plastic that lasts a long time. It just gets smaller and smaller and smaller. So there's no point where that plastic stops being plastic. It's still going to be really durable. It's just going to be smaller.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Wonderful. Well, I want to thank Mrs. Hoffman's class up in Toronto and Mrs. Salinas' class in Texas for joining us. We also had 8 viewers online from around the world. And I want you guys to thank Jenna from Adventurers and Scientists for Conservation for telling you about microplastics and what they've learned so far. Wonderful. And if you want to see more adventures and interesting things, check out their website. And you can also look at Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants upcoming talks that they'll have. They'll be able to sit in online. So thanks, Jenna. Thanks very much. And thanks, everyone, for tuning in.
Thanks, guys.